From antique to unique, American Pickers' Mike Wolfe is a renowned collector with a special passion for two-wheeled rides.
American Pickers was built on one simple idea. The greatest treasures are often hidden in the places nobody thinks to look. Week after week, Mike Wolfe and the team uncovered forgotten pieces of American history tucked away in barns, garages, and abandoned buildings.
He was on the trail in Iowa not long ago, but he's no politician. He's looking for diamonds in the rough. With Lee Cowan, meet American picker Mike Wolfe.
But as the years passed, it became clear that the show's biggest discoveries weren't waiting behind old barn doors. They were unfolding behind the cameras. What was really happening while millions of fans were watching? And how did those hidden struggles change American Pickers forever? Join us as we uncover the full story.
If someone would throw out a bike, what else would they throw out? So that's why I started digging in the garbage constantly. Even if it wasn't a big garbage day, I was always in the trash cans and stuff.
The show that shouldn't have worked. American Pickers premiered on History Channel on January 18, 2010, and 3.1 million people watched the first episode, making it the highest-rated debut for the network since 2007. That number was extraordinary for a show with a premise this simple and this quiet. There was no manufactured tension between expert and seller, just two guys from Iowa who genuinely loved old things, driving around looking for them and talking to the people who had been living alongside history without knowing it. Mike Wolfe, the architect of the whole operation, had been trying to get this show made for 5 years before History Channel said yes. Every Otter network that heard the pitch apparently couldn't quite see it. A van, two friends, barns full of junk, no clear villain, no competitive stakes. Mike, who had been picking professionally since childhood and had started filming his own trips on a mini DV camera balanced on his dashboard, kept shopping it anyway. The concept felt obvious to him. The audience, it turned out, agreed. What made the show work was the same thing that made the concept hard to sell. It was genuinely unhurried. In an era of pawn shop, shouting matches, and storage unit bidding wars, American Pickers moved at the pace of a conversation. Mike and Frank would spend 20 minutes with a seller going through the history of a piece before anyone mentioned a price. The seller was always the story, not just the obstacle between the pickers and the find. Viewers who had grown up with grandparents who collected things recognized something real in those conversations. The weight that objects carry when they belong to someone's personal history. Frank Fritz, Mike's co-host and childhood friend, was essential to that dynamic. They had known each other since the 8th grade in Iowa. They had been picking together for over 20 years before the first episode was filmed. That history showed up on screen in the shorthand, the ribbing, the comfort of two people who don't need to perform chemistry, because the chemistry is already there. Frank specialized in toys, oil cans, and advertising items. Mike went for motorcycles, bicycles, and signs. They finished each other's sentences and disagreed about prices and genuinely enjoyed looking at old things together. 14 seasons of that specific dynamic kept the show at the top of its network's ratings. Then, in March 2020, Frank Fritz appeared on camera for the last time. He was going to have back surgery. He expected to come back. Nobody explained to the audience that he might not. So what actually happened, and why did it take years before anyone told the truth about it?
I can remember the first time I seen one of these. I was 14 years old. There was a guy down the street that had one. I think this car going down the road would be 42 to 47,000. I'd be in at 37,000.
The secret that was keeping Frank Fritz off the show. The explanation the public received for Frank Fritz's disappearance from American Pickers was vague to the point of being almost deliberately uninformative. He had back surgery, needed time to recover, and the show continued without him. He was absent for the rest of season 21. Then season 22 arrived in January 2021, and he still wasn't there. It went on like that. Danielle Colby, the show's antique dealer and office manager, stepped into more on-location picking segments. Mike's brother Robbie started appearing more frequently. Nobody said Frank's name, explained his absence, or indicated whether he was coming back. Fans started asking questions that the network had no intention of answering directly. Then, in July 2021, Frank himself broke the silence in an interview with The Sun. He confirmed what fans had suspected. He had been fired by History Channel. He had checked himself into an alcohol treatment facility in Iowa, the Abbey Center, for 77 days. He had spent time trying to get sober, dealing with the consequences of his failed engagement, and trying to figure out what came next. He said he was 11 months sober at the time of the interview. He was direct about his situation in a way that the network had conspicuously avoided being. He also said something that landed like a grenade in the carefully managed silence around the story. He hadn't spoken to Mike Wolfe in 2 years. He knew his back was messed up, but Mike hadn't called to ask how he was doing. He implied Mike had been plotting to replace him with his brother, and had been angling for more screen time at Frank's expense for years. That narrative, the loyal friend abandoned by his co-star when things got difficult, became the story the internet ran with, because it was the story Fritz was telling, and nobody else was contradicting it publicly. What Mike was protecting, and what he only revealed after Frank died, was something considerably more complex than a celebrity feud over screen time. In a November 2024 interview with People weeks after Frank Fritz's death, Mike disclosed that Frank had become addicted to opioids after his back surgery. The surgery itself had involved inserting 2 large rods into his spine and 185 stitches. The pain management required for that level of spinal work created the exact conditions: legitimate medical need, prescribed opioids, a person with an existing susceptibility to substance dependence that had already derailed Frank's life with alcohol once before. With the time off and the surgery, Mike told People, it was like the perfect storm. Frank became addicted to opioids, and that's when everything changed. The show required clean drug tests as a condition of appearing. Frank couldn't pass them. History Channel had no choice but to let him go. Mike had the choice of explaining that publicly, and chose not to, protecting his friend's privacy while absorbing the public perception that he had orchestrated Frank's removal for self-interested reasons. That protection came at a real cost to Mike's own reputation. For 3 years, the dominant narrative around the split was that Mike had frozen out his childhood friend for competitive reasons. Frank's own interviews reinforced that reading. Mike said almost nothing to contest it. The truth, that Frank was fighting an opioid addiction that the show couldn't accommodate, and that Mike was keeping private out of loyalty, remained buried until there was no longer a Frank Fritz who could be further protected by the silence. What Mike said about that silence in the People interview was careful but honest. The things said in Fritz's 2021 interview were a lot of noise, and many of them weren't true. But he also said that Frank's addiction was ultimately Frank's story to tell, not his. He had continued to pray for him. He had wanted things for him that Frank had to want for himself. And when they did eventually reconcile in 2022, talking again after the silence, Mike said it had been easy to forgive Frank because he knew it wasn't Frank talking, it was his addiction talking. That reconciliation happened just as Frank's health took a turn that made forgiveness both urgent and, in retrospect, perfectly timed. Because 2022 was the year that everything got considerably worse in a way that no amount of recovery planning could accommodate. What happened to Frank Fritz on the 4th of July, 2022, and what did it mean for the life he had been trying to rebuild?
Reality TV star and Quad Cities native Frank Fritz passed away last night. His American Pickers co-star Mike Wolfe paying tribute to his longtime friend on social media, calling him a dreamer who was just as sensitive as he was funny.
The friendship that almost ran out of time. On July 14th, 2022, a friend discovered Frank Fritz on the floor of his Davenport, Iowa home and called 911. The call captured the friend saying he might be seizing, that he wasn't sure. Frank was then rushed to hospital where he was diagnosed with stroke. His father, Bill Fritz, told the media that his son was doing better every day. The recovery, however, was not what doctors had hoped for. Frank was released from hospital to a nursing facility. He was placed under guardianship. Friends who visited described a man who had been left unable to walk reliably, who was in a wheelchair, who would never be the same person physically that he had been before that floor in Davenport. The stroke had not killed him outright. It had taken him somewhere in between, alive but diminished, present but profoundly changed, in a facility rather than in his farmhouse or on a back road hunting for old things. The life circumstances surrounding the stroke matter because they form the accumulated context of what had happened to Frank across the previous 4 years. The engagement to Diane Bankson, his on-and-off partner of decades, had collapsed in 2019 in a dispute each of them described differently, each blaming the other for infidelity, leaving Frank with a tattoo on his arm that said once a cheater, always a cheater, a sold farmhouse, a broken engagement, and a drinking problem he addressed by checking himself into the Abbey Center. The opioid addiction that followed his back surgery had cost him the television career that had been the most visible and financially stable chapter of his professional life. He had sold his Iowa farmhouse for $358,000 in 2021 after the split with Deanne, and was living more modestly. The feud with Mike, or the version of it Frank was publicly narrating, the version the internet believed, was playing out while his health was quietly deteriorating. Mike posted about the stroke on his social media, asking fans to keep Frank in their hearts and thoughts. He said he had decided to be private about what was happening and the journey his friend was on. Then, in 2022, they reconciled. Mike said it had been so easy when they did speak again, because he knew what had been happening. The two men got back to something real before the stroke made everything harder. In December 2025, by his own account to People, Mike was at Frank's bedside in hospice care as his friend's health declined following the lingering effects of the 2022 stroke.
American Pickers star Frank Fritz has died. His longtime co-star and friend Mike Wolfe confirmed his death on Instagram. No cause of death details for now.
Fritz died on September 30th, 2024, at 60 years old. His official cause of death was listed on his death certificate as late sequela of cerebral infarction, the medical terminology for damage caused by a stroke, with cerebral vascular disease as the underlying condition. The coroner also noted aortic stenosis and COPD as contributing factors. So what did the show look like after Frank Fritz died? And how did a man who had just lost his childhood friend manage to keep going?
I know exactly what you mean.
I bought a motorcycle when I was 15. I still got it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well,
Oh, yeah. We both ride quite a
One of the
bit.
bikes in there is it's been with us over 40 years.
The changes nobody wanted to make. American Pickers continued without Frank Fritz from season 22 onward, and the show's producers made the practical decision that reality shows always make in these situations. They kept going. Mike picked with his brother Robbie, with Danielle Colby, and with newer cast member John Saleh. The format stayed the same, and the show reached its 27th season in 2025 and 2026. But something had permanently changed in the texture of the thing. Not in a way that could be pointed to in any single episode, but in the cumulative sense that any long-running show carries when one of its founding presences is simply gone. Frank's absence from seasons 22 through 27 was a gap that no replacement picker fully closed. Not because nobody else was capable. Robbie Wolfe is a genuinely skilled picker with real enthusiasm, but because the dynamic of two childhood friends with 20 years of picking history behind them cannot be replicated by any other combination of people. That dynamic had been the show's DNA. When it left, the show became a different organism that happened to share the same title and format. Mike himself has been open about carrying Frank's memory into every property they visit. He told the New York Post that every day on set, they think about Frank, that there are so many things on every property that capture their attention and connect them to him. That is not a PR answer. That is a man still processing a loss while continuing to do the work they shared. He said it was kind of hard to talk about because it was so fresh, and that Fritz was with them in spirit every single day. One of the concrete consequences of that loss was a decision Wolfe made in April 2025 that he described as tough. Antique Archaeology's Nashville location, which had operated for nearly 15 years in the Marathon Motorworks complex, closed permanently. Mike posted about it with the emotional register of someone acknowledging the end of a chapter, rather than simply closing a business. He said the place had meant the world to him, not just the brick and mortar, but the people and the community. The visitors from all over the world who had come through those doors had reminded him every day why he started the journey. The Iowa location of Antique Archaeology remains open. Nashville is gone. That closure came 7 months after Frank's death. Whether the loss of his friend directly influenced the decision to close a store they had both been associated with is something Mike hasn't stated explicitly. But the timing and the language he used to describe it suggests a man making deliberate choices about what to carry forward and what to let go of in the aftermath of grief. And the question now is what he does with all of it. So what is Mike actually building in 2026? And where does the show go from here?
There's really nothing like a motorcycle with a little personality and some character. I've always wanted to preserve motorcycle history and share it with the world.
The future, history's greatest picks. With Mike Wolfe premiered on February 22nd, 2026, and the format is both familiar and different from anything Mike has done before. 8 60-minute episodes produced by Cineflix Productions, exploring legendary artifacts and relics from across American history, from Captain Kirk's original Star Trek command chair to Lee Harvey Oswald's exhumed coffin. The premise is not about buying and selling in the traditional American picker's sense. It is about the stories behind objects that have already been designated as significant. The treasure hunt replaced by the excavation of meaning from things already found. Mike has described the new project as uncharted territory for him. The studio format is genuinely different from spending 5 days a week in a van looking for properties to knock on. He has said he doesn't care what they call it as long as they keep telling stories about history and keep people interested in discovering things that deserve to be coveted. American Pickers itself continues. Season 27 has been airing on History Channel with Mike, Robbie Wolfe, Jersey John, and Danielle Colby. The show took its first hiatus in 15 years in the closing months of 2025, which Mike described as something that was going to feel good after the relentless pace of production that had barely paused since 2010. It resumed with new episodes in February 2026. The hiatus was itself a marker of how much had changed. For 15 years, the show had run without a meaningful break. The year it finally took one was the year Frank Fritz died, and a drunk driver hit the vintage car. Danielle Colby, who had been with the show since the beginning as the expert behind the antique archaeology counter, remains a central presence. She has described Frank's absence from the show as something that weighs on everyone who films it. Her own social media presence during the aftermath of his death, and Klein's accident, reflecting a genuine emotional investment in the people around her, rather than the performance of it. What Wolfe said to the Daily Mail in early 2026 about Frank, after all of it, after the feud narrative and the addiction and the stroke and the death, and his own hand closing his friend's eyes, was this: he wanted people to know that they had loved each other like brothers, that it had been a once-in-a-lifetime friendship, that what people had seen on television between them had always been real. He said he was his friend since 8th grade, and that a lot of times on a property, there are things that capture their attention and connect them to him. Now, the question that sits in the space left by all of it is not whether American Pickers will continue to air. It will. History Channel has 17 seasons of proof that people keep watching. The question is what the show is now, with Frank Fritz buried in Iowa and the Nashville store closed and a new series about legendary artifact airing Sunday nights. The answer, as of 2026, seems to be something that Mike Wolfe is still figuring out in real time, but doing it with an accumulated weight that the van definitely wasn't carrying in 2010. Is there a version of this story where Frank Fritz gets the help he needs in 2020, stays on the show, and lives to pick another barn? And if so, at what point did the system around him fail to provide that version? And the second question, when Mike Wolfe closes his friend's eyes in a hospice room and then drives to a filming location the next season, what exactly is he selling to the audience that's still watching? And is it still the same thing the show started out being? Share your thoughts with us in the comment section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.